Hey guys, Brandon, Sky Soldier Dog Training. So today, I wanted to make a video that I think a lot of people need to see, especially if you're in St. Louis and you're thinking about training or finding a dog trainer here in St. Louis, and you're on the fence of what is a correction. This is a video where I want to go through, and I've obviously got plenty of footage in the other videos of corrections, but I want to go over my philosophy behind corrections just based on me training dogs, my take on it. I'm not going to give you the science or the established credential approach to it because I spend most of my time training dogs rather than theorizing about training dogs. Let's go over a couple things today when we talk about corrections, what it is and what it isn't. What is the goal in doing a correction? I've got a couple things on here. I've got what does a correction look like for a dog? So we'll go over that. I have pressure is scalable. How does prey drive impact correction choice? And then escalate versus de-escalate, because all of this stuff is important. So what does a correction look like for a dog? So generally speaking, a correction can be, when we're talking about the tool, it could be a slip lead, it could be a dominant dog lead. So this is just a fabric dominant dog lead, which is very similar to like a slip lead, and essentially it's just a choking mechanism that will go around the dog's neck. And when the dog does something that we don't want them to do, and generally speaking, we're going to use obedience to kind of introduce the correction or the discipline aspect of what we want, because we're just not going to correct a dog for something that we don't want them to do if we've never taught them to do something, because you're just basically bullying the dog even though they don't know the difference between right and wrong. So this here is a dominant dog lead. It's a fabric one, and it's a choking mechanism, just like a slip lead would be or a choke chain. So we've got that. We've also got a choke chain. So, terrible name for today's society because everybody's gonna be super, super soft about it, which is fine, but we need to be based in reality. So you have a choke chain, so it's a metal version of a slip lead or a dominant dog lead, and it does a choke as the correction for the dog. And then we've got a scary, scary prong collar. Now this is a Herm Sprenger collar. These are the only prong collars that I use here in my facility. And there are many other versions, many other companies, but I only use Herm Sprenger just because of the reliability and the safety aspect. So when you pull the leash, the prongs engage on the dog, and I've actually got some footage of a short that I once did where I put a balloon into a prong collar. I blew the balloon up and pulled the prong collar, and the balloon never popped. So somebody put on a comment there like, do you believe that a balloon is equivalent to a dog? Well, do you believe that a balloon is tougher material than a dog's neck? I don't know. So we've got a prong collar here. As you can see, the prongs are not sharp or jagged because that's not the purpose of the prong collar, is not to stab the dog. And that takes me to another little tidbit that I'd like you guys to have a bit more clarity on. Is I'm sure you've gone onto Google or you've gone onto Reddit and you typed in prong collar and you've seen pictures of embedded little holes from prong collars, and I'm gonna give you the truth on where a lot of those pictures come from. So a lot of those pictures come from rescues or some kind of like humane society or something, where these dogs are scooped up from places where they're generally like neglected or tethered to a tree or something like that, and the collar has been embedded in the dog's neck. Unless you're a world's strongest man or something in that realm, you're not going to be able to correct the dog hard enough on the prong collar that leaves indentations in the dog's neck. You're not going to be able to puncture the dog's neck with the correction of the prong collar. And so it's very misleading for you as the pet owner when you hear, oh, well, the prong collar can embed in the dog's neck. That's not entirely true, because all of those pictures are coming from dogs that have been rescued from situations where they're neglected. So a dog has been tied to a tree and a prong collar happens to be on, and the dog's been at this tree for about a month with the prong collar on. Overwearage of any collar can impact the dog's fur around their neck. It can create hot spots, which creates soft marks for the dog's neck, and then the collar, or whatever it is the dog's wearing, because it could be a choke chain as well, can embed in the dog's skin because it's overwearage. So that's just something for you guys to consider. An Educator e-collar, which has settings to 0 to 100. There is a training application for a lot of those numbers, but anything in my place of business, generally speaking, 50 and above are for things that I don't want to talk to the dog about ever again. So like digging holes, counter surfing, chewing on things, eating poop. Those are going to be reserved for my 50 and above numbers, and those are things where I'm not going to I don't want to have to keep talking to you about jumping on the counter. I don't want to keep talking to you about digging holes. So I'm going to use 50 and above for that correction. And generally speaking, when dogs come in here and we work on an e-collar, because the e-collar is the thing that they respond best to, we're going to respond, or we're going to use typically between 5 is the lowest number that typically dogs can feel, generally up to 15. Now that's a range because some dogs have a higher pain tolerance or like prey drive. When the dog is excited or fearful or nervous, when their prey drive is up, their adrenaline's going and their pain tolerance is up. So that's where having an e-collar can be very effective because you have 0 to 100 as far as the pressure range. You know, and one of the questions that I get often is, why don't you use the vibrate function? Well, for me, what I've seen in my training lessons is that with the vibrate, generally speaking, the vibrate is one setting. Now, I'm sure you can get some off of Amazon where you can turn the vibrate up, but I'm not sure it's that noticeably different between like number 1 vibrate and number 10 vibrate. It may be, you know, almost like 1 and 2, but it's not that noticeable. And for like Educator, you can't turn the vibrate up. They do have a pager one, but again, if it's gonna be too much for the vibrate, it's always gonna be too much for the dog. So it's gonna be like an overcorrection every time. Or if it's not enough to deter the dog from doing something, it's never gonna be enough. So that's generally why I don't use the vibrate as a corrective tool in obedience, is because I don't have that range. I don't have that flexibility, because you want the pressure that you're using on the dog to be scalable, okay? So one more thing that I've got here, and then this might be very unique to even some of you trainers out there. This is a tug. It's burlap and foam, but I will often use this as what they would call nowadays a bonker. A bonker is something that can be foreign, or something that's, you know, like you could use a towel and wrap, you know, electrical tape or zip ties around it and make it into a burrito. And this could be something where, like, if you don't want to use a remote collar and you've got one of these, and you know your dog jumps up on the counter, boom, right over top the noggin with this, and they're probably not going to jump on the counter again. And something that I'd like to add to this, because I think there's a lot of criticism to something like this or any of these corrections. The purpose of the correction is to teach the dog to stop doing something that we don't want them to do. And the dog should learn through A, being taught what we want them to do, but then B, also being taught what we don't want them to do. They should learn to stop doing the behavior that we don't want them to do. That being said, we don't have to continually discipline them, because they're learning through the cause and effect, or the consequences of their actions. So when you use something like this, it's not every interaction. And I think that's the exaggerated dramatic response to corrections in general, is that people think that using this or a bonker or an e-collar or a prong collar is every interaction with the dog, and it's not. It's those interactions where the dog does something that we don't like, we create the consequence and we match it or we level it to the point of where the dog goes, yeah, it's not worth it to do this again. So it's not every interaction, but it's when the dog does those things that we don't like, we give them something they don't like and they stop doing it. And I want to make this very, very clear, because in today's society, we're very opposed to consequences and discipline and things like that. But I'm here to tell you that if you have kids or you have dogs and you're not willing to give them consequences, life certainly will give them consequences. And we see this quite often today, where there's people that don't have any ability to handle adversity or consequences because they've never had to deal with it in the past, because their parents have either helped them, whether doing it for them, or helped them avoid it, and then they've avoided them themselves and then made whatever that thing was that they struggled with even bigger because they've been constantly avoiding it. So rather than avoid the discipline action, let's just create the consequence so that way life doesn't give our dogs a consequence. And when we talk about life giving our dogs consequences, it's usually like the dog nips or bites somebody or attacks another dog or kills another dog, and then our dog gets euthanized as a result of their decision making. And really it's on us for not giving them the right feedback in those situations to avoid that decision making. Okay, so let's go into what does a correction look like for a dog. Okay, so we've got Harold the Husky here. Obviously, this isn't a real dog. Obviously. We got a dominant dog lead, because generally when I have dogs come in here, regardless of their MO, I typically start with a slip lead or a dominant dog lead, or even a choke chain. It just depends on the size of the dog and the moxie in the dog. But the reason why I start in here, and like I said, if you guys don't know, I'm Brandon Sky Soldier Dog Training. I train here in St. Louis. If I have all kinds of behavioral issue dogs coming in here. I have puppies coming in here. I work with all kinds of breeds, all kinds of issues. But why I find myself starting with a slip lead or a dominant dog lead or even a choke chain, and this slip lead is actually going to be a bit too small, or this dominant dog lead is going to be a bit too small for Harold here. He's got a bit of a fat neck on him. So let's go ahead and try and throw a choke chain on Harold here. All right, even this is a bit small for Harold. He's got a big old fat double chin there, Harold. So why I start with a slip lead or dominant dog lead or choke chain on a dog when they come into my shop is because, generally speaking, these dogs have never been disciplined for anything to start with. One of the people often ask, like, Brandon, why do you talk about discipline so much on your social media when it comes to dogs and dog training? Well, because discipline is the number one thing that most dogs are missing. It's not love and affection. When you go on social media for dog training, you'll find purely positive or you'll find balance, and purely positive is always talking about how there's not enough affection, there's not enough engagement, there's not enough rewards. But I would say, based on just using observational data and just looking at things, most people already love their dogs. That's why they get them, because they love dogs. And I would say that the one thing that's lacking is actually boundaries and discipline and accountability, rather than specifically love and affection and engagement. So, that's why I talk about it so much. But why I start with a slip lead or a choke chain or a dominant dog lead typically with dogs is because they don't have any discipline whatsoever. And so they don't have any discipline to start with, plus they don't typically know anything. Some dogs will come to me and they've been through 3 or 4 trainers, and these trainers haven't been able to get the dog to do anything because they've started with just treats, or the trainer themselves are scared of the dog or unsure of what the dog's going to do, and the dog can sense that, and so the dog just manipulates the lesson or whatever. And so I try to start off with a lot of grace to give a dog an opportunity to make decisions and then build from that. Because, and we're going to talk about this later, but there's an escalation versus de-escalation of the correction tool that we use, or the pressure tool that we use with the dog. And we always want to make sure that the pressure tool that we're using de-escalates the dog versus escalating. And if the dog doesn't know anything at all, if it doesn't know place, sit, down, heel, doesn't know any of those things, it doesn't even know how to take lead pressure, and you throw a prong collar on that dog, generally speaking, that's going to escalate the dog. Now, I could board and train a dog and put a prong collar on a dog in the first day, but I also know how to use the leash. I also know how to, de-escalate the dog. I also know how to push the limit that the dog has without pushing them too far. But a lot of my owners have no idea how to correct their dog or how to do it in a fair and effective way. So I start off with less pressure to not only help the owner, but help the dog to understand what it is I want them to do and not want them to do without creating a lot of drama out of the dog. So that escalate versus de-escalate. So I start lower on pressure, and no matter what people think about the name of a choke chain or a slip lead, generally speaking, a choking mechanism is going to be less of an emotional response out of the dog than a prong collar or even an e-collar. But e-collars are generally pretty flat. So it's the choking mechanism is going to be generally less of an emotional draw than a prong collar is. Okay? And we may even use a martingale. It just depends on the dog. So we got a choke chain here. The anatomy of Harold here is pretty wild. But I want to have the choke chain pretty high. And when I go to correct the dog, it's simply going to be, and I'll zoom in here so you guys can see it. If Harold does something I don't like, I'm going to bring the lead up. There's his chin and all that. His windpipe is right down here. And if Harold does something I don't like, it's simply a no and a tug. Okay, and if I'm doing place command, I'm going to tug Harold in the direction of where I want him to be. All of my corrections are going to be in the direction or where I want the dog to be. So if the dog jumps off the place, I'm going to correct back towards the place. So I'm going to tell him no and tug in the direction of the place. Now, obviously, Harold is a fake dog, and I can make him jump and dance around quite a bit with this, but my level of my correction is going to be based on what the dog needs to do what I need him to do. It's not going to be to shut them down. It's going to get them to stop doing whatever it is I don't want them to do. If it's jumping off the place, I'm going to give them a hard enough correction to where they go, yeah, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to start by slinging them across the room because that's not effective and it's not creating anything that we want. And so obviously if the dog escalates it, then I'm going to have to escalate. And if they're escalating because of the pressure, then I need to look at that pressure tool and ask myself, does this dog know what I want them to do, or do they not care what I want them to do? And if we're talking about a new dog, they probably don't know. So again, it's a no and a tug from the lead, okay? Not too bad, right? Goes from loose to tight to loose, just like that, okay? So now, if we slide this off and we throw a prong collar on, and again, I'll put some footage of that prong collar in the balloons so all of the prong collar haters out there can get really upset with me because I'm a jerk and I use prong collars on dogs. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't pop a balloon. So we threw a prong collar on Blake here. And as you can see, Blake is not a real dog. But we threw a prong collar on Blake so you guys can see this, because for all of those prong collar haters out there, we're gonna have a little bit of a discussion and a training point here. I'm also gonna put the footage of me using a prong collar with a balloon. But one of the reasons I'm not using a fake dog because I'm afraid to correct a dog with a prong collar, obviously. But I'm not gonna correct a dog if it's not doing anything wrong. So I'm gonna use Blake here to show us that. So when we talk about the prong collar, a couple of struggle points for pet owners in general. When you go to a prong collar, why is my dog acting more dramatic with the prong collar? Well, for one, it might be more pressure than what they've ever received before. So it's natural for them to respond in a dramatic way to something that's a lot more pressure than what they've gotten before. Plus, if you just started training and you just started implementing rules and structure and boundaries, the dog might protest just a little bit because you've been living a certain way with the dog, and the dog's expectation for life is I can do whatever I want. And now things are changing, and naturally there's a protest. That's going to be a short-lived thing as long as you stand firm. The reason we're going to stand firm and we're not going to panic and get dramatic is because these things are in the dog's best interest. And there are plenty of things that I can think of in my life where my parents were like, you need to do this, and I didn't want to do it, but it was in my best interest for me to do it. Or even times in the Army where there were things that I didn't want to do, and the Army was like, you should do this, and I was like, well, I don't want to do this, and it was in my best interest to do those things. So, you know, like I said, one thing that could create drama out of your dog is just the fact that it's more pressure than what they're used to. There is another aspect of that, like if it's more pressure than they're used to, if you've never given them a correction or any kind of discipline or punishment before, and then you immediately jump to a prong collar. You know, let's say you've never trained your dog knows how to sit for a piece of cheese but then pieces out, like you don't have any real solid obedience, and you want your dog to walk better, and you get on the Facebook HOA page and you're like, my dog walks like crap, and you know, Karen down the road is like, oh, we used a prong collar on our poodle and it just fixed everything. You know, meanwhile, she also got the dog trained and learned how to use the prong collar, but she tells you just get a prong collar. Well, you get a prong collar, and that dog of yours that has no rules in the house to start with gets a new corrective tool put on them, they probably are going to be pretty dramatic to it. I mean, you'd be surprised, some dogs don't even respond to it at all. They're like, whatever, I'm just going to keep doing what I do. So before you go to something like this, you want to make sure your dog actually knows what it is you want them to do and what the standard is before you just immediately jump to something like this. Because these are training collars, not just specifically walking collars, which I think is a big misconception with pet owners, is it's a tool to be used in all types of training. You don't want to just pull out the big guns for specific instances, because then the dog only listens in those specific instances. Or the dog gets dramatic or weird in those instances because it knows you're going to pull out the big guns. So then when we talk about the prong collar, I think there's a couple misconceptions, and I have a video specifically on prong collars where I talk about the fit, the size, all the equipment, and there's another video called Louie Gets a Prong where we can watch a dog that's super dramatic to the prong, but he needed a prong, and he's much, much better now. But in that video, he was super dramatic, and it's a good video for you guys to watch. But I've got the prong collar rather high up on the dog's neck. So with Blake here, you know, the anatomy looks like this. So his windpipe and his trachea would be right around here, because typically this is where the neck ends. The trachea and windpipe's gonna be down here. And I want the prong collar to be higher up on Blake, because Blake is a little bit more of a pushy dog and he needs a more precise correction. There is, you know, I think there's a lot of conflict and argument on this, but a prong collar is going to slide because your dog's going to scratch this, they're going to twist, they're going to move, it's going to fall down. It's going to fall down, and then there's this block right here. It's called a trach block. If you look at the website for Hermspringer and it shows you all the components of it, this is called a trach block, and the trach block is supposed to block the trach. So the prong collar can fall. Not only that, but some dogs can wear the prong collar a little bit lower. For softer dogs that need a little bit extra than a martingale, he'll put a prong collar on, but he'll leave the prong collar down a little bit lower because there's a lot more muscle tissue right around here. And so, yes, the prong is a little bit more than a martingale, but they don't have it way up top here where there are less muscles, and so it's kind of like watering down your coffee, if you will, with milk. Essentially, we're making the prong collar a little bit lighter by pulling it down a little bit lower. But generally, when I'm working with dogs, I have it higher up because if I need a prong collar, I'm going to use it high up and give that precise correction. I've got a 225 on him. If he even weighed, if he weighed over 100 pounds, I'd probably look at a 3.0 or higher, but a 225 millimeter is going to be perfect for an under 100-pound dog. So when I correct the prong collar, and I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can see it, it's the same thing as that choke chain. I'm going to give a no and a pop. So we'll do it again, and I'm going to hold Blake this time so you guys can see it. No and pop. No and pop. Just like that. And typically, if I'm correcting a dog for jumping off place, it's going to be no, place. No, tug, place. That's how I'm going to correct the dog. Now you notice when I pull the leash, the prong engages, and then it releases. So my correction isn't this with a prong collar. My correction is this with a prong collar. And if I've got a dog that's a little bit more amped up, I might do something like this. Nope. And it's released. Notice how the leash releases. That's how I'm typically going to correct the dog. There's no slinging or anything like that. Okay, so now that we've seen what it looks like to correct a dog from the leash specifically, and the choke chain and the prong collar, let's talk about my my terminology or my thought process on pressure being scalable, or why it should be scalable. You know, when we talk about why does a dog not do what I want them to do, the oldest question in the book is, why is my dog not doing what I want them to do? There's two answers. They don't know or they don't care. That's it. For any situation, anything that you're talking about the dog doing something that I don't want them to do, they either don't know or they don't care. So the answer for don't know is teach the dog. Do more repetitions and teach the dog what it is you want them to do, and then what you don't want them to do. And once you've established those repetitions and you can safely say, well, my dog will do it in this setting, but they won't do it in that setting. Ask yourself, do they know or do they care? If your dog doesn't know, again, you do the repetitions. But if your dog doesn't care, you raise the pressure, because the pressure can be the motivator for the dog to stop doing what we don't want them to do. A treat, a reward, or affection, or a slab of beef is not the right metric to get the dog to stop doing something. Because if my son is punching his brother, me giving him an Xbox game and going, please don't punch your brother again, is not going to stop him from punching his brother. It doesn't work. It's not going to work for the dog. It's not going to work for your kids. So you have to raise the pressure if the dog doesn't care. So if we started training with a slip lead with our dog and we've taught them how to do plates, sit, down, we've started the groundworks of heel, but then once we start to do plates outside and there's a bit more distractions going on, that slip lead starts to lose its power. Why is it losing its power? Because the dog's prey drive impacts the correction choice. And the dog's prey drive is associated with their excitement, with their fear, with their nervousness, with the influence of distraction. Their prey drive goes up. As a dog's prey drive goes up, their pain tolerance goes up. That's why you have so many different tools, is so that you can use the right corrective tool to speak to the dog in the moment. And again, the counter to this, or the modern persuasion to this, is, well, why don't you have a better reward? And I've seen this before, and I've heard somebody say, well, like, if you have a herding breed, what is going to stop the dog from hurting your children? A slab of beef? You're gonna have to pull out a New York strip every time you want the dog to stop hurting your children? No, do not do that. Find the correct pressure to motivate your dog to stop doing that. And so pressure should be scalable, because we want to start with saying, does my dog know what I want them to do? Yes or no? Yes? Cool. Then they don't care. Raise the pressure. If they don't know, again, teach them. Once you teach them, then ask that second question, ask if they don't care. Okay, so that's why pressure is scalable. And we covered a little bit there that prey drive can impact correction choice, because as I said, is the prey drive goes up, the pain tolerance goes up of the dog. It's a natural mechanism of the dog. If you want to think of, like, instead of thinking of obedience and training, and you want to think of a dog in their natural habitat, so to speak, think of like a German short hair pointer. When those guys see a bird in the field, they go stiff. And typically speaking, pheasants aren't hanging out in like a super soft, cush, casual bush. You know, they're hanging out in spots where there's thicket or thorns, and the dog really has to kind of get in there and get nasty to flare the birds so that we can shoot the pheasant. And so if the dog's prey drive goes on and the dog's like, oh my gosh, there's a bird, but then it sees the thorns and then it sees the brush and it's like, nah, I can't go in there, man, you got to go get them yourself. What's the point? Right. When that dog gets worked up, it's boom, it goes in there and it rushes those birds right through the thorns and thicket, because its prey drive gave it a higher pain tolerance. Just the same way as certain breeds will get super fixated on something, and there's plenty of videos of these specific breeds really locked in, and you'll see people come in and hit 2x4s over the dog's head, and they're still locked in, latched onto that other dog, and that's prey drive. So prey drive raises the pain tolerance, which inherently means that we need to raise the pressure level. It's not about necessarily inflicting pain, it's about communicating stop. If I ground my children from books and they don't read, well, that's a pretty ineffective punishment there, okay? So then last but not least, let's talk about escalate versus de-escalate. So when we talk about pressure, our goal is to de-escalate the dog, because our correction is to stop whatever behavior it is, ranging from disobedience, such as jumping off the place or getting out of the sit or breaking the down or breaking the heel or not coming when called. Our goal is to get them to stop doing those things and start doing what we want them to do. But there are corrections that we should have for our dog that stops really dangerous behavior. And so it really shouldn't amplify the dog, it should bring the dog down. And that's one of the beautiful things about the remote collar, especially when I'm working with fearful dogs here in my studio. You will see fearful dogs that won't take treats. So no matter what the critics say, you can't pull out enough treats to get these dogs to work because they're just not interested in it. But you can use e-collar pressure, and some of those dogs, they're just terrified, and so we'll use e-collar pressure as a way to kind of get them closer to us. You know, we use it on anywhere from as low as 5 to generally anywhere high as 15 to 20. It just depends on the dog, and we'll teach the dog to, you know, come closer to us by using e-collar pressure. Now we could spend days and months and years and, you know, try to get that dog to warm up to us, but I've only got 5 weeks generally. And let's just be honest, most of you owners will type on here that I've got enough patience to wait years for my dogs to warm up, but you're lying to yourself and you're lying to everybody else that you're typing to. So we can use that to bring a dog closer to us. They go to the end of the leash, we hold the e-collar, they learn as they start to scoot closer to us, we turn the e-collar off. They learn that the closer they are, the less that e-collar pressure is being applied. And then when we talk about those dogs that get really dramatic when there's a leash tug, well, you know, these are all things that you want to keep in mind when you're working with your dog. Is I want to de-escalate the dog that I'm working with. So if my correction from the leash escalates my dog, go back to this, ask if they know or if they care. And if you know that they know, and you're saying they don't care, well, it might be that you have a very personal correction attached to that leash and your dog really doesn't believe you or takes things very personal from that prong collar, choke chain, or whatever's attached to the leash. So a lot of times with the e-collar, we can create an almost neutral response to the correction because it's not attached to the leash. And so for certain dogs that are a little bit more sensitive to leash corrections, an e-collar can be a fantastic tool because it's super devoid and it's super neutral because it's not attached to a leash. So at the end of the day, when we wrap all of this up, a correction is not a forever thing. You know, one of the things that I hear a lot of my owners talk about, especially when we put a prong collar on their dog, is how long do I have to use the prong collar? Well, you don't want to just completely take the collar off, because if you need it and don't have it, you're screwed. But if you have it and you don't have to use it, then what's the problem? So I usually tell my clients, like, get to the point of where you don't have to correct your dog. That's what you should shoot for, because it's not a forever thing. Once you've taught it, once you start to ingrain it, and generally speaking for me and my clients, I will tell them 5 months to 10 months of application of anything that we teach can really become habit forming for any dog. If you're holding the line for that amount of time, you can probably create really reliable dogs in just doing that, and then you probably don't have to correct them because they know the difference between right and wrong. But if you only do this for a handful of weeks, or you only do this in specific situations, but you don't do it all the time, or you don't do it long enough, forget it, it's not gonna work. And you're gonna always be chasing your dog that's doing something bad, because you're not consistent enough. And not only that, for some dogs, negative attention is better than no attention. So, you know, in summary, a correction isn't permanent. A correction isn't the end of the world, and it's not every interaction with our dog. But it is pivotal in changing the dog's behavior and their ability to hold whatever we're asking them to do. Because you can either choose to bribe them with a treat, but you'll forever have to do that, because what's the thing that's gonna stop them? You're always gonna have to do it. Or correct them. And they go, oh, I don't like this. They modify their behavior. All right, guys, like I say on my social media, my Instagram and Facebook from time to time, have fun with your dogs, train your dogs. See you guys.